Some mysteries haunt entire communities for decades, leaving families desperate for answers that never seem to come. When experienced bus driver Margaret Chen failed to return from her regular route in November 1989, investigators found no trace, no witnesses, no clues, nothing. But why did the search focus on the wrong area for 20 years? What crucial evidence did authorities overlook? And how did a devastating storm finally reveal the truth everyone had feared? What Hurricane Isabel uncovered in 2009 would change everything. Before we begin, comment your hometown if you love connecting with viewers who grew up in the same area as you. Margaret Chen was 34 years old when she vanished without a trace. A mother of 2 young children, she had been driving buses for the Metro Transit Authority for 8 years. Her colleagues knew her as reliable, careful, and devoted to her job. She never missed a shift, never complained about difficult passengers, and always completed her routes on time. On November 15, 1989, she began what should have been an ordinary Tuesday evening shift. It was a route she had driven hundreds of times before. But Margaret would never make it home that night. The morning of November 15th started like any other for Margaret. She kissed her 7-year-old daughter goodbye and promised her 5-year-old son she would read him a bedtime story when she returned from work. Her husband, David, later told investigators that Margaret seemed happy and relaxed that morning. She had even mentioned planning their Thanksgiving dinner just 10 days away. There was nothing unusual about her behavior, nothing that suggested she knew this would be her last day at home. Margaret's shift began at 3:30 p.m. at the Metro Depot on Riverside Drive. Her supervisor, Frank Morrison, remembered checking her bus before she left. The vehicle was in perfect condition, recently serviced, with a full tank of gas. Margaret's route, Line 47, ran from downtown through several residential neighborhoods before ending at Maple Ridge Shopping Center. It was a route that took approximately 2 hours to complete. She was scheduled to return to the depot by 8 p.m. Frank expected to see her bus pulling in right on schedule, as always. Margaret's first few stops went exactly as planned. Passengers later reported that she seemed normal, greeting regular riders with her usual warm smile. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly woman who rode the bus twice a week to visit her sister, was among the last people to see Margaret alive. She boarded the bus at 4:15 p.m. at the corner of Oak Street and 3rd Avenue. Mrs. Hartwell later told police that Margaret asked about her sister's health and mentioned that the weather was turning cold. It was a brief, friendly conversation between 2 people who had known each other for years. The bus continued its route through the residential areas of Eastwood and Ferndale. At each stop, Margaret followed her usual routine, opening the doors, helping elderly passengers, making sure everyone was safely seated before continuing. Several passengers remembered her being particularly patient with a confused elderly man who wasn't sure where he wanted to go. She took extra time to help him figure out his destination. This was typical behavior for Margaret, who was known for her kindness toward all passengers. But something was about to go terribly wrong. At 6:45 p.m., Margaret made her scheduled stop at Ferndale Community Center. 3 passengers got off, and 2 got on. The last person to board her bus was a young man in his 20s, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap. One passenger, James Rodriguez, later described the man as nervous and fidgety. He kept looking around and checking his watch. James thought it was strange but didn't think much of it at the time. After all, people were often anxious or in a hurry when riding public transportation. Margaret's bus was now carrying only 4 passengers as it headed toward the final stretch of the route. The next stop was supposed to be at Hillcrest Avenue, followed by 2 more stops before reaching the shopping center. But the bus never made it to Hillcrest Avenue. Somewhere between the community center and that next stop, Margaret Chen and her bus simply disappeared. What happened during those 20 minutes would remain a mystery for the next 20 years. The answers lay hidden in a place no one thought to look. David Chen began to worry when Margaret didn't arrive home by 9 p.m. She had never been more than a few minutes late without calling. He tried reaching the transit depot, but the phones were busy. At 9:30 p.m., he called Margaret's supervisor, Frank Morrison, at home. Frank told him that Margaret's bus hadn't returned to the depot, and they were starting to get concerned. The last radio contact with Margaret had been at 6:30 p.m. when she reported being on schedule at Ferndale Community Center. Frank immediately called the police and reported a missing bus and driver. Within an hour, patrol cars were driving along Route 47 looking for any sign of Margaret or her bus. They checked the shopping center, thinking perhaps she had mechanical trouble and was stranded there, but the parking lot was empty except for a few late shoppers. The police expanded their search to nearby streets and parking lots. They found nothing. It was as if Margaret and the 30-foot-long city bus had simply vanished into thin air. The search began in earnest the next morning. Police, transit officials, and volunteers spread out across the city, following every possible route Margaret might have taken. They checked hospitals, thinking she might have had a medical emergency. They contacted towing companies, wondering if the bus had broken down and been towed. They even checked with other transit systems in case she had somehow ended up in the wrong location. Every lead turned into a dead end. Detective Sarah Walsh was assigned to lead the investigation. She had been with the police department for 12 years and had handled many missing person cases. But this was different. People don't just disappear with a city bus. The vehicle was too large to hide easily, too distinctive to go unnoticed. Detective Walsh interviewed Margaret's family, friends, and co-workers, looking for any clue about where she might have gone. Everyone told her the same thing. Margaret was a devoted mother and reliable employee who would never abandon her responsibilities. Something terrible had happened to her. Detective Walsh carefully interviewed the 4 passengers who had been on Margaret's bus during that final stretch of the route. Their stories were consistent but troubling. James Rodriguez, the man who had noticed the nervous passenger, described him in detail. The young man had gotten off the bus at the community center, the same stop where he had gotten on. He had only ridden for 1 stop, which seemed odd. Why board a bus just to travel such a short distance? The other 3 passengers, an elderly woman named Dorothy Mills, a teenage girl named Lisa Park, and a man in his 40s named Robert Turner, all remembered the nervous passenger. They described him similarly: white, average height, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. None of them had seen him clearly enough to provide a detailed description for a police sketch, but they all agreed that something about him had seemed strange. Detective Walsh began to wonder if this mysterious passenger was connected to Margaret's disappearance. As days turned into weeks, the search for Margaret Chen expanded beyond the city limits. Police contacted law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties, asking them to watch for the missing bus. The vehicle's license number and description were entered into national databases. Margaret's photograph was distributed to police departments across 3 states. Local television stations ran stories about the disappearance, asking viewers to call if they had any information. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that Margaret's personal belongings were missing along with the bus. Her purse, which she always kept in a locked compartment behind the driver's seat, was gone. So was her lunch bag and thermos. This suggested that whatever happened to Margaret had occurred while she was still with the bus, not after she had abandoned it somewhere. The evidence pointed to either an abduction or something even more sinister. But without the bus, investigators had no crime scene to examine. David Chen struggled to hold his family together as the investigation continued. His children asked every day when their mother would come home. He didn't know how to answer them. Margaret's disappearance was front-page news for weeks, but as time passed with no new developments, public attention began to fade. The family held vigils and organized search parties. They put up missing person posters throughout the city. They offered a reward for information leading to Margaret's return. Margaret's mother, Linda Wong, moved in with David and the children to help care for them. She told reporters that Margaret had been planning to go back to school to become a teacher. She had always loved working with people, and teaching seemed like a natural next step in her career. Margaret had been saving money for tuition and had already requested information from several colleges. She had too much to live for to simply disappear voluntarily. Someone had taken her from her family, and they deserved to know what happened. 6 months after Margaret's disappearance, Detective Walsh had interviewed hundreds of people and followed up on dozens of leads. None of them had produced any solid evidence about what happened to Margaret or her bus. The case file grew thicker, but the mystery remained unsolved. The nervous passenger from the bus had never been identified, despite extensive efforts to find him. Police sketches based on passenger descriptions were distributed widely, but no one came forward with information about his identity. The Transit Authority conducted its own internal investigation, looking for any possible problems with Margaret's employment or personal life that might explain her disappearance. They found nothing suspicious. Margaret's work record was spotless, and her co-workers described her as professional and reliable. Her route logs showed no unusual incidents in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The bus she was driving had no mechanical problems and had passed its most recent safety inspection. Every lead seemed to end in frustration. Margaret's disappearance had a profound impact on the entire transit system. Bus drivers became nervous about working evening shifts, especially on routes that passed through isolated areas. The drivers' union demanded better safety measures, including panic buttons and more frequent radio check-ins with dispatchers. Some drivers requested transfers to different routes, unwilling to work the Line 47 that Margaret had been driving when she vanished. Passengers also felt the effects of Margaret's disappearance. Many people, especially women traveling alone, became afraid to ride the bus after dark. Ridership on evening routes dropped significantly in the months following the incident. The community that had once felt safe using public transportation now lived with the fear that something terrible could happen without warning. Margaret's disappearance had shattered the sense of security that people had taken for granted. The mystery cast a shadow over the entire city. As the first anniversary of Margaret's disappearance approached, various theories began to emerge about what might have happened to her. Some people believed she had been the victim of a random crime, possibly carjacking or robbery gone wrong. Others thought the nervous passenger might have been involved in her disappearance. A few suggested that Margaret might have staged her own disappearance, though this theory was quickly dismissed by everyone who knew her well. Detective Walsh privately favored the theory that Margaret had been forced off her normal route at gunpoint and driven to a remote location. But this raised difficult questions. Where was the bus? How could someone hide such a large vehicle? And why hadn't Margaret been able to use her radio to call for help? The police radio in the bus had been working perfectly when she left the depot. If she had been in danger, she should have been able to request assistance. The lack of any distress calls suggested that whatever happened had occurred very quickly. 2 years after Margaret's disappearance, the case was officially classified as a cold case. Detective Walsh had been promoted and transferred to a different department. The investigation was assigned to Detective Michael Torres, who reviewed all the evidence and interviews but found no new leads to pursue. The file was stored with hundreds of other unsolved cases, waiting for new information that might never come. David Chen had moved his family to another state, unable to bear living in the city where Margaret had disappeared. He left a forwarding address with the police, hoping that someday they would call with news about his wife. The children, now older, rarely spoke about their mother's disappearance. They had learned to live with the uncertainty, though it had shaped their entire childhood. Margaret's case became one of those mysteries that haunted the community, but seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. Throughout the 1990s, Margaret's case was occasionally revisited when new detectives were assigned to the cold case unit. Each one approached the evidence with fresh eyes, hoping to find something that previous investigators had missed. They re-interviewed witnesses, reviewed physical evidence, and explored new investigative techniques as they became available. DNA analysis was performed on items found in Margaret's locker at work, but there was no unknown DNA to compare it against. The nervous passenger remained an enigma. Despite numerous attempts to identify him, including age-progressed sketches and appeals on television crime shows, he was never found. Some investigators began to doubt whether he was actually connected to Margaret's disappearance. Perhaps he had simply been an ordinary passenger who happened to be anxious about something unrelated. Without more evidence, it was impossible to know for sure. The case seemed to have reached a permanent dead end. As the new millennium arrived, advances in technology offered new hope for solving old cases. Computers could now cross-reference information more efficiently, and DNA analysis had become more sophisticated. Margaret's case was entered into national databases that hadn't existed in 1989. Investigators hoped that improvements in forensic science might eventually provide the breakthrough they needed. But technology alone couldn't solve the fundamental problem. There was no physical evidence to analyze. The bus had never been found, Margaret's body had never been recovered, and the mysterious passenger had never been identified. The case file contained hundreds of pages of reports, interviews, and theories, but no smoking gun that would point to what actually happened on that November evening in 1989. Margaret Chen had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. Linda Wong, Margaret's mother, never gave up hope that her daughter would be found. Even as years passed without any new developments, she continued to contact the police regularly, asking if there were any updates on the case. She organized annual memorial services on the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance, hoping to keep public attention focused on the unsolved mystery. She believed that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened to her daughter. Linda often visited the bus depot where Margaret had worked, talking to drivers and mechanics who had known her. She hoped that eventually someone might remember a detail that could help solve the case. The transit authority had replaced the buses from Margaret's era with newer models, but some of the older employees still remembered her fondly. They described her as a dedicated worker who had genuinely cared about providing good service to passengers. Her disappearance had left a void that was never quite filled. In 2003, Detective Maria Santos took over Margaret's cold case as part of a department-wide review of unsolved disappearances. She was struck by one detail that previous investigators had noted, but perhaps hadn't fully explored: the timing of Margaret's last radio contact. At 6:30 p.m., Margaret had reported being on schedule at Ferndale Community Center, but passengers had seen her leave that stop at 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes later than her radio report indicated. This discrepancy had been explained away as a simple error. Perhaps Margaret had looked at her watch wrong, or the radio log had been recorded incorrectly. But Detective Santos wondered if there might be more to it. Had Margaret been delayed at the community center for some reason? Had something happened during those 15 minutes that previous investigators had overlooked? She decided to revisit that time period, interviewing anyone who might have been at the community center that evening. Detective Santos discovered that on the evening Margaret disappeared, the Ferndale Community Center had been hosting a job fair that ran until 7 p.m. This meant there had been more people in the area than usual, including some who might not have been regular bus passengers. The job fair had attracted people from various backgrounds, some of whom might not have been familiar to the regular commuters who used Margaret's bus route. The detective obtained a list of companies that had participated in the job fair, along with the names of their representatives who had been present that evening. Most of these people had never been interviewed in connection with Margaret's disappearance. Detective Santos began the painstaking process of tracking them down, hoping that someone might have witnessed something important. It was slow work, as many of the job fair participants had moved on to different jobs or even different cities in the 14 years since Margaret's disappearance. One of the job fair participants that Detective Santos contacted was Thomas Mitchell, who had been representing a construction company in 1989. Thomas had a remarkable memory for details, and he remembered that evening clearly because he had been running late and had to rush to pack up his booth. As he was loading materials into his car in the community center parking lot, he had noticed a city bus parked at the stop across the street. What struck Thomas as unusual was that the bus sat at the stop for an unusually long time. He estimated that it was there for at least 10 minutes, much longer than buses typically stayed at any single stop. He had assumed that the driver was dealing with some kind of problem, perhaps a difficult passenger or a mechanical issue. Thomas hadn't thought about the incident again until Detective Santos contacted him. He had no idea that the bus he had observed might have been connected to an unsolved disappearance. Thomas Mitchell's observation provided the first new piece of evidence in Margaret's case in over a decade. If his memory was accurate, Margaret's bus had remained at the Ferndale Community Center stop for approximately 10 minutes longer than usual. This could explain the discrepancy between her radio report at 6:30 p.m. and the time passengers remembered leaving the stop at 6:45 p.m. But it raised new questions. What had caused the delay? Had Margaret been dealing with a problem passenger? Had someone threatened her? Detective Santos re-interviewed the passengers who had been on the bus that evening, focusing specifically on what they remembered happening at the community center stop. Most of their memories had faded over the years, but James Rodriguez, the man who had noticed the nervous passenger, recalled that there had seemed to be some kind of commotion at the front of the bus while they were stopped. He had been sitting toward the back and couldn't see clearly what was happening, but he remembered thinking that Margaret was talking to someone for longer than usual. The extended stop at Ferndale Community Center took on new significance when viewed in connection with the nervous passenger. According to the original witness statements, this man had boarded the bus at the community center and had seemed agitated throughout the short ride to the next stop. What if his nervousness hadn't been because he was anxious about something unrelated to the bus ride? What if he had been planning something that involved Margaret and her bus? Detective Santos created a new timeline based on the revised information. Margaret had arrived at the community center stop on schedule at 6:30 p.m. Something had happened during the next 15 minutes that caused an extended delay. The nervous passenger had boarded during this time, ridden for one stop, and then gotten off. Margaret's bus had continued toward its final destination, but had never arrived. The nervous passenger remained the last person known to have had contact with Margaret before her disappearance. Based on the new timeline and witness information, Detective Santos began to reconsider where Margaret's bus might have ended up. Previous searches had focused on areas along the official bus route and nearby streets. But what if Margaret had been forced to deviate from her normal path? What if she had been directed to drive to a location far from her usual route? The detective obtained detailed maps of the area and began to identify remote locations where a large vehicle could be hidden. The search area expanded to include abandoned industrial sites, old quarries, and dense wooded areas within a 50-mile radius of Margaret's last known location. Many of these places had never been searched in connection with her disappearance. Some were privately owned property that would have required search warrants to access thoroughly. Others were so remote that they hadn't been considered possible hiding places for a city bus. Detective Santos began the process of systematically investigating these locations. The reality of police work in the early 2000s meant that cold cases often received limited resources. Detective Santos was working on Margaret's case along with dozens of other unsolved crimes. She couldn't authorize expensive search operations without strong evidence pointing to a specific location. The department's budget for cold case investigations was tight, and helicopters or specialized search teams cost thousands of dollars per day. She needed more concrete leads before she could justify such expenditures. Despite these limitations, Detective Santos continued to work the case in her spare time. She used her own car to visit remote locations on weekends, looking for any sign of the missing bus. She contacted local pilots who might have noticed abandoned vehicles during flight training exercises. She reached out to hunters and hikers who regularly visited remote areas, asking if they had ever seen anything unusual. Most of these efforts yielded no results, but the detective remained determined to find answers. By 2005, Detective Santos had exhausted most of her new leads without finding Margaret or her bus. The nervous passenger remained unidentified, despite renewed efforts to locate him. The extended stop at Ferndale Community Center had provided context for Margaret's disappearance, but hadn't revealed what actually happened to her. The case returned to cold status, filed away with hundreds of other unsolved mysteries. Detective Santos moved on to other assignments, though she never completely forgot about Margaret Chen. The passage of time had not diminished the pain felt by Margaret's family. David Chen had remarried and started a new family, but he still thought about his first wife every day. Margaret's children, now adults, had learned to live with the uncertainty surrounding their mother's disappearance. They had successful careers and families of their own, but the unanswered questions about their mother's fate continued to affect them. The mystery had become a permanent part of their lives, a wound that had never fully healed. In September 2009, 20 years after Margaret's disappearance, Hurricane Isabel was approaching the eastern United States. Weather forecasters predicted that the storm would bring heavy rains and strong winds to the region where Margaret had vanished. Emergency management officials warned residents to prepare for potential flooding, power outages, and property damage. The hurricane was expected to be one of the most powerful storms to hit the area in decades. As Isabel made landfall, it brought torrential rains that caused rivers and streams to swell beyond their banks. Areas that had been dry for years were suddenly underwater. The storm surge pushed water into valleys and low-lying areas that rarely experienced flooding. Roads were washed out, trees were uprooted, and buildings were damaged by the powerful winds. It was the kind of storm that changed the landscape, revealing things that had been hidden for years. 3 days after Hurricane Isabel passed through, a local resident named Carl Henderson was checking on his property in a remote area about 30 miles from where Margaret had disappeared. The storm had caused significant damage to his land, washing out part of an old access road that led to an abandoned quarry. As Carl walked around surveying the damage, he noticed something unusual in a ravine that had been carved deeper by the storm's floodwaters. Partially buried in mud and debris, Carl could see what appeared to be the rusted remains of a large vehicle. The object was mostly covered by 20 years of vegetation growth and storm debris, but Carl could make out what looked like the distinctive shape of a city bus. He immediately contacted the local sheriff's office, reporting his discovery. Within hours, investigators were at the scene, carefully excavating what would prove to be the answer to a 20-year-old mystery. The vehicle in the ravine was indeed a city bus, and the license plate confirmed what investigators had hoped and feared. It was Margaret Chen's missing bus. The ravine was located in a heavily wooded area that was accessible only by a narrow, unmarked dirt road. During normal weather conditions, the bus would have been completely hidden from view by dense vegetation. Only the powerful floodwaters from Hurricane Isabel had exposed enough of the vehicle to make it visible. Detective Santos, now a supervisor in the cold case unit, was contacted immediately about the discovery. She drove to the scene and stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down at the bus that had eluded searchers for 2 decades. The vehicle was severely deteriorated from years of exposure to the elements, but it was unmistakably the bus that Margaret had been driving on that November evening in 1989. The mystery of its location had finally been solved, but many questions remained. Removing the bus from the ravine was a complex operation that required specialized equipment and careful planning. The vehicle had become embedded in the slope of the ravine, held in place by tree roots and decades of accumulated debris. Crime scene investigators had to document everything before the bus could be moved, photographing and measuring every detail of its position and condition. The excavation process took several days and required the use of heavy machinery to safely extract the bus. As workers carefully removed mud and debris from inside the bus, they made a grim discovery. Human remains were found in the driver's area, along with personal items that had belonged to Margaret Chen. Her purse was still there, containing her driver's license and family photographs that had somehow survived 20 years in the elements. The confirmation that investigators had dreaded was now undeniable. Margaret had died in her bus, far from the route she was supposed to be traveling. The forensic examination of Margaret's remains and the bus provided crucial evidence about what had happened on that November evening in 1989. The position of Margaret's body indicated that she had died while still in the driver's seat. There was no evidence of a struggle inside the bus, suggesting that whatever had caused her death had occurred quickly. The forensic pathologist determined that Margaret had suffered a fatal head injury, though the exact cause was difficult to determine after 20 years. Investigators found something else significant in the bus: bullet holes in the windshield. The glass had long since disintegrated, but the metal frame showed clear evidence of gunfire. Ballistics experts determined that the shots had been fired from outside the bus, directed at the driver's position. This evidence suggested that Margaret had been murdered, shot, while sitting behind the wheel of her bus. The remote location where the bus was found indicated that she had been forced to drive there before being killed. Based on the physical evidence and witness statements from 1989, investigators began to reconstruct what had happened to Margaret Chen. They believed that the nervous passenger observed by other riders had been involved in her disappearance. This person had likely boarded the bus at Ferndale Community Center with the intention of forcing Margaret to drive to the remote location where her body was eventually found. The extended stop at the community center may have been when the passenger revealed his intentions to Margaret. The fact that Margaret's radio had not been used to call for help suggested that she had been threatened immediately and ordered not to contact anyone. The passenger had probably directed her to drive off her normal route, taking the unmarked dirt road that led to the abandoned quarry. Once they reached the isolated location, Margaret had been shot and killed. The murderer had then abandoned the bus in the ravine, where it had remained hidden until Hurricane Isabel's floodwaters exposed it 20 years later. With new physical evidence and the recovery of Margaret's remains, her case was officially reopened as a homicide investigation. Detective Santos assembled a team to re-examine all the evidence from 1989 in light of what they now knew about the crime. The mysterious passenger who had seemed nervous during the bus ride was now the prime suspect in Margaret's murder. Unfortunately, 20 years had passed, and many of the original witnesses had died or moved away. The investigation faced significant challenges. The crime scene had been exposed to the elements for 2 decades, destroying much of the potential forensic evidence. The suspect had never been identified, despite extensive efforts in 1989 and subsequent years. DNA evidence from the bus was contaminated by 20 years of exposure to rain, snow, and wildlife. The case that had seemed unsolvable in 1989 remained extremely difficult to prosecute, even with the discovery of Margaret's body and the bus. News of the discovery of Margaret Chen's bus and remains generated intense media attention. The story made headlines across the region, bringing renewed attention to a case that many people had never forgotten. Margaret's family experienced a mixture of relief and renewed grief. They finally knew what had happened to their loved one, but the confirmation of her death brought fresh pain after 20 years of uncertainty. David Chen, now remarried with teenage children, spoke to reporters about the discovery. He said that while he was grateful to finally have answers about Margaret's fate, he was saddened that she had died alone in such a frightening situation. He expressed hope that the reopened investigation would eventually identify her killer and bring justice for Margaret. Her adult children also spoke publicly about their mother's case, describing how her disappearance had affected their entire lives. Despite the passage of 20 years, investigators refused to give up on finding Margaret's killer. They re-examined the description of the nervous passenger, created new age-progressed sketches showing what he might look like in 2009, and distributed these images to law enforcement agencies across the country. They also used new database technology to cross-reference similar crimes that might have been committed by the same person. The investigation revealed that there had been several other attacks on public transportation workers in the region during the late 1980s and early 1990s. While none of these cases involved murder, the pattern suggested that someone had been specifically targeting bus drivers and subway operators. Investigators began to wonder if Margaret's killer had committed other crimes before and after her murder. This possibility expanded the scope of their investigation, but also made it more complex. Advances in DNA analysis since 1989 offered new hope for solving Margaret's case. Investigators submitted evidence from the bus to the FBI's forensic laboratory, hoping that microscopic traces of the killer's DNA might have survived 20 years in the elements. While much of the evidence was too degraded to be useful, technicians were able to extract partial DNA profiles from several items found in the bus. Unfortunately, the partial DNA profiles were not complete enough to definitively identify a suspect. They could be used to exclude potential suspects or to confirm a match if investigators found someone to compare them against. But without a specific person to test, the DNA evidence was of limited value. The case still depended on traditional detective work, finding witnesses, following leads, and hoping that someone would come forward with information about the mysterious passenger. Margaret's case was featured on several television programs that specialized in cold cases and unsolved mysteries. The shows recreated the events of November 15, 1989, and appealed to viewers to contact police if they had any information about the nervous passenger or the crime itself. The programs generated dozens of phone calls and tips, each of which had to be carefully investigated by detectives. Most of the tips turned out to be false leads or cases of mistaken identity. Some callers claimed to recognize the description of the suspect, but provided information about people who were either deceased or could be ruled out for other reasons. A few tips seemed promising, but led to dead ends when investigated further. The television exposure kept Margaret's case in the public eye, but didn't produce the breakthrough that investigators were hoping for. As the investigation continued, Margaret's family and friends worked to ensure that she would be remembered for more than just her tragic death. They established a scholarship fund in her name at the local community college, providing financial assistance to students pursuing careers in education. Margaret had planned to become a teacher before her death, and the scholarship honored that dream while helping others achieve their educational goals. The Metropolitan Transit Authority also honored Margaret's memory by implementing new safety measures for bus drivers. Panic buttons were installed in all buses, along with improved radio communication systems and GPS tracking. While these measures came too late to save Margaret, they provided better protection for current and future transit workers. Margaret's death had not been in vain if it prevented similar tragedies from occurring. For Margaret's children, now adults with families of their own, the discovery of their mother's remains brought a sense of closure that they had never expected to experience. They were finally able to hold a proper funeral for Margaret and lay her to rest in the cemetery, where other family members were buried. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including many transit workers who had known and worked with Margaret. Margaret's daughter, now a teacher herself, spoke at the funeral about how her mother's disappearance had shaped her life. She said that growing up without knowing what had happened to her mother had been incredibly difficult, but it had also taught her to appreciate every day and to value the time she spent with her own family. She expressed gratitude to everyone who had worked to keep her mother's case active over the years, and hoped that her mother's killer would eventually be brought to justice. The investigation into Margaret's murder expanded to include similar cases from across the country. Detectives used national databases to identify other crimes involving attacks on public transportation workers, particularly cases where the perpetrator had been described as a nervous or agitated passenger. They found several cases that shared common elements with Margaret's murder, suggesting the possibility of a serial offender. One particularly intriguing case involved the murder of a bus driver in a neighboring state just 6 months after Margaret's disappearance. The victim had been found shot to death in his bus, which had been discovered in a remote location similar to where Margaret's bus was found. The description of a suspicious passenger in that case bore some similarities to the nervous passenger from Margaret's bus. Investigators began to explore whether the same person might have been responsible for both crimes. Despite renewed efforts and modern investigative techniques, Margaret's case began to stall once again. The leads generated by television coverage and the reopened investigation had been thoroughly pursued, but none had led to the identification of her killer. The DNA evidence was insufficient for a database search, and the physical evidence from the crime scene had been too degraded to provide definitive clues about the perpetrator's identity. Detective Santos, now nearing retirement, continued to work on the case but acknowledged that it might never be solved. The passage of 20 years had eliminated many potential witnesses and allowed the killer to potentially commit other crimes or even die without ever being identified. The case remained active in the department's files, but it no longer received the intensive attention that had followed the discovery of Margaret's remains. In 2015, advances in DNA analysis offered fresh hope for cold cases like Margaret's. New techniques allowed forensic scientists to extract usable DNA profiles from increasingly small and degraded samples. The evidence from Margaret's case was resubmitted to the FBI laboratory, along with samples from hundreds of other cold cases. Scientists hoped that improved technology might reveal genetic information that had been undetectable in previous analyses. The results were mixed. While the new techniques revealed additional genetic markers from the evidence, the profiles were still incomplete and couldn't be used for a database search. However, the improved DNA profiles could be used to definitively exclude suspects or confirm a match if investigators found the right person to test. This gave the investigation team hope that Margaret's killer could still be identified if he was ever arrested for another crime. In 2017, nearly 30 years after Margaret's disappearance, an unexpected break came in the case. Robert Chen, no relation to Margaret, contacted the police department with information he had been carrying for decades. Robert had been a maintenance worker at Ferndale Community Center in 1989, and he had witnessed something on the night Margaret disappeared that had troubled him ever since. Robert explained that he had been working late that evening, cleaning up after the job fair. Around 6:45 p.m., he had gone outside to empty trash cans when he noticed a city bus parked at the stop across the street. What caught his attention was that a man was standing at the front of the bus, apparently arguing with the driver. The man appeared agitated, gesturing with his hands and leaning toward the driver's window. Robert had assumed it was a dispute about fare or routing, and hadn't thought much of it at the time. Robert's testimony provided crucial new details about what had happened during Margaret's extended stop at Ferndale Community Center. He described the man as white, probably in his 20s, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap. The man had seemed very upset about something and had been talking intensely to the bus driver. Robert estimated that this confrontation had lasted about 5 minutes before the man boarded the bus. What made Robert finally come forward after all these years was seeing Margaret's story featured on a crime documentary. He realized that the argument he had witnessed might have been the beginning of the sequence of events that led to her murder. He felt guilty for not reporting what he had seen earlier, but he explained that at the time he had no idea that anything serious was happening. It had seemed like an ordinary dispute between a passenger and a driver. Robert's testimony helped investigators understand what might have motivated Margaret's killer. The confrontation outside the bus suggested that this had not been a random crime, but rather something that had escalated from an initial dispute. Perhaps the man had been angry about a previous interaction with Margaret, or maybe he had boarded the bus with the specific intention of confronting her about something. Detective Torres, who had taken over Margaret's case from the retired Detective Santos, theorized that the killer might have been someone who had ridden Margaret's bus before and had developed a grievance against her. Bus drivers sometimes had to deal with difficult passengers, enforce rules about behavior or payment, or ask disruptive riders to leave the bus. It was possible that Margaret had had a previous encounter with this man that had made him angry enough to plan revenge. Based on the theory that Margaret's killer might have been someone who had interacted with her professionally, investigators began examining employment records from companies that had participated in the job fair at Ferndale Community Center. They reasoned that the killer might have attended the job fair and then waited for Margaret's bus as an opportunity to confront her. This would explain why he had been in the area and why he had seemed nervous and agitated. The task was enormous. Dozens of companies had participated in the job fair, and hundreds of people had attended. Many of the companies no longer existed, and employment records from 1989 were often incomplete or had been destroyed. Some companies had been absorbed by larger corporations, making it difficult to track down former employees. Investigators had to contact each company individually and request any records they might still have from that time period. As investigators reviewed employment records and conducted background checks on job fair attendees, they began to notice a pattern. Several of the companies that had participated in the job fair had been involved in disputes with the transit authority over city contracts. Some had bid unsuccessfully for lucrative municipal contracts, while others had been terminated from existing agreements due to performance problems or alleged corruption. One company in particular caught the investigators' attention. Riverside Construction had lost a major road repair contract with the city just 2 months before the job fair. The company's owner, Frank Kellerman, had publicly blamed city officials for what he claimed was unfair treatment. Kellerman had made angry statements to local newspapers, accusing the city government of corruption and favoritism in their contract decisions. Investigators wondered if his anger toward the city might have extended to city employees like Margaret. Background checks on Frank Kellerman revealed a history of conflicts with authority figures and problems controlling his temper. He had been arrested twice in the 1980s for assault, once for attacking a customer who had complained about his work, and once for fighting with a building inspector who had cited him for safety violations. Both cases had been resolved with plea agreements, but they established a pattern of violent behavior when Kellerman felt wronged or disrespected. More troubling was the discovery that Kellerman had employed several young men in their 20s during 1989, any of whom could have matched the description of the nervous passenger. Investigators obtained employment records for Riverside Construction and began the process of tracking down these former employees. Many had moved on to other jobs or different cities, but detectives were determined to interview each one and determine if any of them had been at the job fair on the night Margaret disappeared. One of Kellerman's former employees particularly interested investigators. Danny Walsh had been 22 years old in 1989 and had worked for Riverside Construction as a general laborer. According to employment records, Walsh had been terminated from his job just 1 week before the Ferndale Community Center job fair. He had been fired for showing up to work intoxicated and arguing with supervisors. Walsh's description matched that of the nervous passenger, white, average height, in his 20s. Tracking down Danny Walsh proved challenging. He had moved frequently over the years, working various construction and manual labor jobs throughout the region. He had been arrested several times for minor offenses including public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and driving under the influence. Each arrest had resulted in short jail sentences or probation, but Walsh had never been convicted of a violent crime. Investigators finally located him living in a trailer park about 2 hours from where Margaret had been murdered. When detectives approached Danny Walsh for questioning in 2018, nearly 30 years after Margaret's murder, they found a man whose life had been marked by failure and disappointment. Walsh was now 51 years old, unemployed, and struggling with alcoholism. He initially denied any knowledge of Margaret Chen or her disappearance, claiming he had never heard of the case. However, when investigators mentioned the Ferndale Community Center job fair, Walsh's demeanor changed noticeably. Walsh admitted that he had attended the job fair on November 15, 1989, looking for work after being fired from Riverside Construction. He claimed to remember very little about that evening, saying that he had been drinking heavily during that period of his life. When investigators pressed him about whether he had ridden a city bus that night, Walsh became agitated and asked for a lawyer. The interview ended without a confession, but investigators were convinced they had found Margaret's killer. With Danny Walsh identified as their prime suspect, investigators worked to build a case that could stand up in court. They had witness testimony placing him at the scene, physical evidence from Margaret's bus, and a motive based on his recent firing and attendance at the job fair. However, the case was still largely circumstantial. Walsh had not confessed, and the DNA evidence was insufficient to definitively prove his guilt. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and determined that while Walsh was likely guilty of Margaret's murder, proving it beyond a reasonable doubt would be extremely difficult. Nearly 30 years had passed since the crime. Key witnesses had died or could no longer remember details clearly, and much of the physical evidence had been degraded by time and weather. The decision was made to continue investigating, hoping to find additional evidence that would strengthen the case against Walsh. In 2019, 30 years after Margaret Chen's murder, Danny Walsh was found dead in his trailer from an apparent heart attack. He was 52 years old and had never been formally charged with Margaret's murder. His death meant that Margaret's family would never see her killer face trial, but investigators remained convinced that Walsh had been responsible for her death. The case was officially closed, though the lack of a conviction left some questions unanswered. Margaret's family held a final memorial service, marking the end of a 3-decade journey seeking justice for their loved one. Her children, now middle-aged adults with children of their own, spoke about how their mother's case had affected generations of their family. They expressed gratitude to the investigators who had never given up on finding answers, even when the case seemed hopeless. While they would have preferred to see Margaret's killer face trial, they found some peace in knowing that he was no longer alive to hurt anyone else. The discovery of Margaret's bus in 2009 had provided answers that her family had waited 20 years to receive. Hurricane Isabel had literally uncovered the truth, exposing what everyone had feared but needed to know. Margaret Chen's story became a reminder that some mysteries, no matter how cold they become, never truly die. Sometimes justice comes not from courtrooms and convictions, but from the simple act of finally knowing what happened to someone who was loved and missed. In the end, Margaret was remembered not as a victim, but as a devoted mother, dedicated worker, and cherished member of her community whose memory lived on long after the mystery of her disappearance had been solved. The question that haunts investigators to this day is whether Danny Walsh acted alone that November evening, or if someone else knew about his plans and chose to remain silent for 30 years.